Thank you very much. Really pleased to be here. So I really thank the National Gallery of Singapore for inviting me to give this talk, as well as, of course, sort of curating the exhibition, figuring a scene based on the history of the Bukit Ho Swee fire, in part, right? Not fully, but they tell me at least that the Bukit Ho Swee fire was a big part of their exhibition. And I'm very grateful that so many of you are here today. They also tell me that this is not the usual art history crowd. So I see some friends here and probably, from the heritage sector, from the history sector. So I'm quite sure we'll have a good discussion later. So thanks for coming here on Sunday morning. Yep. Hopefully the text is not too small. My research on the Bukit Ho Swee fire was based on my PhD, and that was in 2005 to 2008. So that's more than 15 years ago now. And prior to doing the research, I always had very ambivalent feelings about Bukit Ho Swee. I kind of live in the Bukit Ho Swee area, the vicinity of Bukit Ho Swee. So here's a picture of me and my mother and my sister at a place called Jalan Membina, which is of course changed beyond recognition today. But behind us, behind this very elementary playground, which is just metal, is the emergency flats that were very common in the 1950s and 60s, built after fires. So this one was built after the 1959 fire in Tiong Bahru, if I'm not wrong. I didn't like living in Bukit Ho Swee, in Indus Road. That's precisely where I live for most of the time there. So I want to get out. I'll talk more about that later on, get out of the area, and we did. So going back to Bukit Ho Swee was, very interesting for me to research something that I didn't know at the time. I had no memory of the fire. I was born after the fire, grew up in all the housing. Subsequently, I did a PhD, published a book a few years later. So I'm a historian today, a people's historian, and I also do a part-time podcast on Chronicles of Old Singapore, where I talk about how Singapore has changed. And of course, Bukit Ho Swee is one of those places that has changed greatly since those years of the fire. By the way, because I did my interviews on Bukit Ho Swee so many years ago, right? The people I interviewed close to 100 people at the time. It's very hard for me to go back to find them now. So I'm still looking for someone from Bukit Ho Swee who's in their senior years to come onto my podcast to talk about their memories of the kampong, the fire, and what happened afterwards. So if you have those memories, or if you know someone with those memories, please let me know. I'm a historian. I've left academia, and I run a small heritage consultancy called Chronicles Research and Education, where I do heritage research projects. And what I want to do today is to talk about the connections between history, memory, and heritage of the Bukit Ho Swee fire. I just want to kind of generally plug the exhibition and the exhibition space, Dalam Southeast Asia, and the particular exhibition in that space called Figuring a Scene. If you have not seen it, I encourage you to. It contains many ways of looking at Southeast Asian society and culture from the lens of things like fire, durians, light and shadow, so on and so forth. I think one of the key themes of the fire, if I understand correctly from Patrick, is to find new narratives of Southeast Asia, of Singapore. And this is what I want to do in the first place in this talk. So one of the things I want to do in terms of new narratives or hidden narratives of Southeast Asia is to talk about some of the other fires in Singapore history. I think you are here today because you've heard about the Bukit Ho Swee fire. And you should know as something about the Bukit Ho Swee fire if you're Singaporean. But I think the exhibition does a great job of showing some of the other fires in Singapore history that are not so well known. So I want to talk about those fires and talk about how Bukit Ho Swee was a historic fire. I want to talk about the memory of the fire, that the memories are fading, right? It is not like what it is today. This is more than 60 years after the fire occurred. So even when I was interviewing people in 2006, 2005, those memories were memories of a very particular generation of people, and we are already losing some of those memories. I want to talk also about heritage, what the Bukit Ho Swee fire means today, what it has left us, right, and what we can use it for going forward in relation to housing especially. So this is probably the weakest part of my talk because I'm still thinking about it. But I think I'm not very sure what the answers are, but I think there is a issue about heritage, of our housing heritage, of our urban heritage that we can look at to try to address some of our issues and concerns about housing today. Okay, so I'm just going to go through very briefly some of the paintings and artworks that are available in the Figuring a Scene exhibition. As I said, they are in the exhibition. If you have time later on, please go and see them if you haven't. So this is a painting of the post-Bukit Ho Swee fire when they began to build the public housing by Tan Chu Kwan in 1962. He painted this in 1962. I really don't know much about art history. I found some of these paintings by accident through the course of my research, and I used them, right? But I think there are some interesting things about some of these paintings. For example, here the estate is still kind of coming up, right? It's still being built, and you can see the trees, they kind of in the foreground, right? It's still, compare this with the next one. Actually, this is two. I don't know if you can see it. There are two paintings here, the left and the right. The one on the left, on our left, is the one with the trees, right? Which is actually dominating the painting, and in the background are the flats that were being built, which are quite indistinct. On the right, you can see the trees are gone, right? And the concrete housing of Bukit Ho Swee estate have come into form. This is one I also found out, and there's a funny story here. This painting is by Lim Yu Kwan, who passed away a few years ago. It's called After Fire. So I went to meet him, I went to interview him, and then we realized in the first few minutes that this wasn't the Bukit Ho Swee fire. And it wouldn't be, because this is 1966, right? 5 years after the fire. So he said, you can't interview me, because this is not Bukit Ho Swee fire. This is probably one of the fires in the eastern part of the Singapore city, maybe in Pulau Minyak, or one of the fires in the Geylang or Kallang area. I'm not sure, actually. But actually, of course, he was just joking. I managed to interview him. This is a real character. This is an earlier fire by Lim Hak Tai, which I haven't seen before, in 1956 in color. And I believe this would have been the fire at Tiong Bahru, the kind of smaller fire at Kampong Tiong Bahru, across from Bukit Ho Swee in 1955, the previous year. And of course, the famous painter Liu Kang, and he's got a painting here of after the fire scene in 1951. This would have been the big fire, the first big fire after the Second World War in the city at Kampong Bugis, right? And this is a very important fire. I don't know why he drew the scene like this, but I think one of the things you can see in the foreground, right, is that there are people there. This is one of the few paintings where there are people. You compare this with the HDB painting after the Bukit Ho Swee fire in 1962. Why are there no people? No people because it's fenced off, right? The HDB fenced off the area. So this fire, the SIT, the British did not fence off the area. So people could go back maybe to, it seems like they are looking to try to salvage their belongings. But what is also going to happen is that people, when they go back to the fire site, they will begin to rebuild their houses in the fire. So for a long time, right, in the early 1950s, the kampong dwellers, the fire victims, would simply go back to the fire site and rebuild the kampong. So Kampong Bugis was rebuilt, and so those are not, you see those rebuilding there. Those were not rebuilt by the government, by the colonial government. Those were rebuilt by a relief organization that was formed to take care of the fire victims. But the problem was they took so long to rebuild that by the time the houses were ready, most of the fire victims had either rebuilt the kampong at Kampong Bugis, or they had gone somewhere else to live in another kampong, right? So this is very much an antithesis of the HDB story, right? At a time earlier when the colonial government was not very much prepared to build houses for fire victims. So this is quite interesting. I haven't seen this before. This is obviously not paintings. This is wooden sculptures by Xu Tingxing in the 1970s. So the one on the left, right, shows sort of like a facade of the HDB block. And it's not very clear here, but you can see it more clearly at the bottom. Actually people holding a net, right? So this is actually quite a grim story of people jumping off the HDB flats in the early years, right? And of course, some of you might know that there are stories that of some of these flats known as suicide flats, right? Where people jump off because they are suicidal. They were suicidal. So that's a very interesting way to look at public housing in those years. And the other one, though, is called Cooperation on the right, where it's trying to paint quite a different narrative and interpretation of public housing, that people actually can cooperate despite living on different floors, right? Despite living in high-rise, that there's friendship, there's community, there's cooperation in HDB housing. So I don't really know the history, the art history here, but these are actually very interesting thoughts about the early public housing. And I kind of draw upon the second one in particular, right, to raise the question whether the early HDB housing can be a place for cooperation, for community later on. I'll talk about this later on. All right, so just to give you some image and idea of the fires of Singapore, I promised to talk about the other fires. So this is a map of the Singapore city in the early 50s. And I've kind of plotted some of the kampongs. There are actually about 56 kampongs in the city in the 1950s. They are in blue. It doesn't look very blue, but you can see that the kampongs are located along the main roads, coming out of the central area. The central area is A and B, right? There is Chinatown, there is Raffles Place, the Singapore River, and that's Tanjong Pagar. So this is where the majority of the people were living, and the kampongs are outside this area because there wasn't enough housing in the shop houses in those areas, and people were having to leave. But they maintain a connection with the central area, with the city, right? Because they are on the main roads and they can easily get to the central area if they want to. So first fire after the Second World War was at Kampong Bugis. 3,000 fire victims, Lorong Geylang, Lorong 3 in 1953. Aljunied, close by. What is that? I can't see myself. Tiong Bahru in 1955, quite a small fire. Kampong Kuchai in 1958, 3 years later on. Tiong Bahru again. So that's a very fire-prone area, right? There are various kampongs there. And of course, Bukit Ho Swee, the biggest one in 1961. So after the Kampong Bugis fire, the British government said we'll launch a survey to study a master plan to develop Singapore and control all these kampongs and all these fire threats. And that, of course, became the master plan in 1958. So Kampong Bugis was important in that sense, although it did not lead to public housing being built. All right, so these are the fires I kind of talked about earlier. And the photo, I wanted to show the photo, right? It's not very clear, but that is actually our second chief minister, Lim Yew Hock. You know, and what's he doing? He's at the fire scene, grabbing a pail and trying to get water to fight the fire. So what do you think about this? It's printed out in the Straits Times. Should the chief minister be at the fire site fighting a fire? You know, and he was criticized by the opposition. I think Lee Kuan Yew criticized him for this, and the other opposition members as well. That you're just there for publicity. You know, does the chief minister know how to fight a fire? Would he be in the way, or would he actually help? Right. But this is also beginning to show that fires were becoming politicized. You know, because of the scale of the disaster, the number of fire victims, that the fires and the question of housing in general was beginning to become a political issue for the political parties. So the Bukit Ho Swee fire happened on the afternoon around 3 p.m. Started actually in Si Ka Ting, which is Kampong Tiong Bahru, across the road, right? The road is Tiong Bahru Road. So it started at 174 in a kampong house at Kampong Tiong Bahru, and then crossed the road into Bukit Ho Swee. So the two parts of Bukit Ho Swee, you can see the road there, Bio Lane, Bukit Ho Swee, those two little roads that kind of dissect the area. The fire just burned through that area. It is Bukit, right? It's a hill. So went up the hilltop, went down the hilltop where it's very hard to stop, reached Havelock Road, crossed Havelock Road, and burned the attap houses on the other side of Havelock Road until the fire reached the northern side, right, Ganges Avenue, where there are SIT flats. So those are concrete flats, and the fire couldn't burn anymore, and it burned itself out at the time. So the fire department was very much criticized for allowing the fire to jump across two roads, right? As a fireman, right, you should not allow the fire to jump across the road, because that's really going to help spread the fire. The kind of fire is kind of a natural fire, what do you call it? Fire break to stop the fire from spreading. But because the wind was so strong, right, the flying embers and material flew across the two roads. Within a year, Lee Kuan Yew, of course, made that famous statement that I'm going to build a house for every fire victim within 9 months. Right? 9 months is very symbolic, right? Why 9 months? I don't think there was a reason for 9 months, except that 9 months is birth, right? I think that's the reason why he used 9 months. So it took slightly longer than that. It took about a year, I think about 14 months, if I'm not wrong, before the first flats of Bukit Ho Swee Estate. So they built Bukit Ho Swee Estate on the fire site to house the fire victims, and most of the fire victims came back to live in this housing. So that's essentially the Bukit Ho Swee fire story. Most of you who know about the fire will be fairly familiar with this story. Yeah, it is why the HDB calls this the blessing in disguise for the people of Bukit Ho Swee. So I'm going to talk about why the Bukit Ho Swee fire was unprecedented, was historic. Of course, the first reason is it was the worst fire. It was the biggest fire. Nearly 16,000 people were registered as fire victims. But it's not just the scale. The scale contributed to the effects of the fire that made it really historic. This was the first big fire that the PAP government under Lee Kuan Yew had to deal with. So it demonstrated, right, in successfully building the public housing for the fire victims, Lee Kuan Yew was able to deliver what he said the HDB would do, his government's political will. So that from that early beginning, people could see that the government could deliver and the government could push through a political project like this. As I showed earlier, I don't know, I think maybe there is maybe it's easier to show the map again. So the government's big project was you got to clear the central area, right? The people living in Chinatown, because Chinatown was overcrowded. But you cannot clear Chinatown just like that, because where are you going to move the people, right? You would move the people outside of Chinatown, close by, but not too far away. So you can't really move people to Queenstown, because who wants to live in Queenstown in those days? Of course, now people want to live in Queenstown, right? But in those days, Queenstown was too far away. I mean, without the MRT, just imagine you take a bus. It's quite far, right? Or the other side of in the Kallang area, people didn't want to live there. So you have to build public housing or alternative housing for the people of Chinatown, just outside Chinatown, in places like Tiong Bahru, in places like the Kallang Basin. And that's why we have those wonderful SIT flats in Tiong Bahru today. So if they could find the land, SIT was willing to build houses there. But there wasn't enough land because the land was taken up by all the kampongs. Right? So there was a kind of a war going on between the kampongs and the SIT flats. So in order to clear central area, what do you have to do? You have to clear the kampongs. How do you clear the kampongs? You can't clear them because the kampong dwellers, like the central area dwellers, do not want to leave the kampongs. They do not want to go to Queenstown either, right? So how do you clear the kampongs? Well, fire will do it for you, right? Can I go on? I think. So transform the urban landscape. So instead of shop houses, we still have shop houses, most of them have been preserved. We don't have the kampongs anymore. Instead of the kampongs, the landscape of Singapore is dominated by public housing. That's become the Singaporean landscape, the skyline, right? But besides the landscape and the housing, the fire also transformed the way we work, the way of life. Everyone who is a Singaporean knows that it's very easy to buy a HDB flat, right? In theory, as long as you have a stable job, because you can use your CPF to pay for the housing. How do you use a CPF? You need to have a stable job. You need to have CPF contributions that allow you to pay for the flat in installments monthly. So that means you need a stable job, right? You can't be a hawker, for example. It's very hard to be a part-time hawker and own a flat. So it transformed the way people work. It pushed people into permanent jobs, regular work, and stable pay. It also transformed the family and community life. There are very few extended families that live inside HDB flats because there isn't enough space. There are not enough rooms for extended families to live inside. I mean, you can kind of have a semi-extended family, like you have a nuclear family and then maybe one or two elderly people living inside. But you can't have like 3 full generations with the uncles and the relatives staying inside a HDB flat. So most of the families in HDB flats are nuclear families or nuclear families with 1 or 2 older people. The communities in the kampongs were broken. They were splintered when they were relocated to HDB flats. So the community life that existed in the kampongs was no longer feasible until time went on and some of the HDB residents began to develop ties with their neighbors. It transformed the economy because it transformed the work. So the economy was turning away from the entrepot trade to industrialization, to industries that provided full-time jobs. So those were the industries that came in: manufacturing, shipyards, hospitality, services that provided full-time jobs. And of course, the government sector grew, right, as a result. So many jobs in the government sector. And it transformed the citizenship, right? People were no longer living in the kampongs who were kind of very suspicious of the government, who were very wary of the government. Now, Singaporeans have almost come full circle, 180 degrees, to become citizens, right? Singaporeans now rely on the government. Singaporeans feel very supportive of the government, even though sometimes some Singaporeans may not agree with the policies, but they often look to the government for support and policy and assistance. So that's a big change in the way that we conduct ourselves in relation to the state. I just want to show this photo. This is a very interesting photo. It seems like a very general firefighting scene, right? But if you look at the photo closely, right, who is actually fighting the fire? Right? It is actually the people, right? They snatched the hoses from the firemen because they didn't trust the firemen and they think they can fight the fire better than the firemen. But this showed, right, that the people living in the kampongs had a totally different mindset from people today. I mean, if there's a fire today, would you snatch the fire hose from the firefighters and think you can do it better? Right? You trust the firefighter to know his job and do his job properly. So a very different time. Our curator, Patrick, is from the Philippines, so I thought I'll show this. It's very small, so I don't think you can see it very clearly. On the left side is the city of Manila, and in the kind of, you can see maybe a little snake, right? That is the, what river is that? Manila River? Pasig River, right? Near the river, right, is a place called Intramuros, which is still there today, the original Spanish city, colonial city. And the black areas, right? They like to show kampong areas, squatter areas in black, like some kind of cancer, right? Because they wanted to remove them. They saw them as a blight on the city. And this is the whole of what later on become Metro Manila, right? And in 1963, the mayor of Manila wanted to remove the squatters from Intramuros. Where? Not anywhere inside Metro Manila, but on the right side map, all the way on the northeast corner, a place called Sabang Palay, outside of Metro Manila to Sabang Palay, a resettlement area. So what the mayor did was to get the families out on that morning, tear down their houses, demolish the houses so you can see the wood on the ground, and then burn them. Right? So this is also a kind of fire in Southeast Asian urban history, and a very deliberate fire in front of the fire victims, the squatters, and therefore fire victims. And they were driven all the way to on the right-hand side, the sort of almost incomplete houses without amenities, without proper amenities in Sabang Palay. All right, so the squatters, the fire victims reach Sabang Palay, and you see those kind of almost like cages where the families are supposed to live. And obviously what happened afterwards? The whole project failed, right? Because who would want to live there? Even if the housing was good, even if there were proper amenities, you wouldn't want to live there because so far away from Manila, where your jobs, where your families and friends would be. So they went back to Manila. So the Bukit Ho Swee fire was unprecedented, was historic that way. Very few other cities in Southeast Asia or even the world have actually managed to do the kind of thing that the HDB had managed to do. However, the Bukit Ho Swee fire was maybe not so unprecedented in a few ways. One was Bukit Ho Swee estate never really shone as a beacon of light in the housing history of Singapore. Bukit Ho Swee estate, where I lived, right, remained one of the poorer and one of the weaker housing estates of Singapore. Right, the people living there were still earning lower incomes, and more people were living in the smaller flats in Bukit Ho Swee compared to other HDB estates in Singapore. Especially the big problem, I think, in the early days of the HDB were two groups of people who live in the one-room flats. So if you were able to live in the bigger flats, like 2-room or 3-room, right? In those days, if you live in a 3-room flat, you were middle class. So the people who live in the one-room flats were not able to buy the flats. They continued to rent the flats. So my father continued to rent the flats until 1989. We lived in Bukit Ho Swee for close to 20 years, right? And he wasn't able to buy a flat until 1989 because he didn't have a stable job. He was a laborer. And we live in this Block 79 in Indus Road, which is still around today and completely rental for mostly, I think, old people, but also young families who are, low income and low education. So for them, for the poor, right, the poverty never really went away. And the other group of people who didn't benefit so much from the HDB project were the elderly people. So this is a big problem, I think, in the history of Singapore. In the HDB history, because by the time that I did my research, right, which is in the early 2000s, most of the older people who live in the Kampong Bukit Ho Swee at the time of the fire were gone, right? They passed away by then. So I wasn't able to interview them. The people I interviewed who were quite in their 60s and 70s and 80s at the time were children or teenagers or young people at the time of the fire. So for the old people, moving to Bukit Ho Swee estate was very difficult, right? That's why we had that wooden sculpture of people jumping off the flats. They didn't jump off the flats because the flats were high-rise, right? But because they were desperately unhappy living in the HDB flats, cut off from the kampong community. HDB living had certain ramifications. It benefited the middle class, the majority, the mainstream. But the middle class also began to change from the kampong and the Chinatown population, right? The middle class was mostly inward-looking. They were not very concerned about the affairs of the society or the community other than their family, other than themselves, right? They were focused on work. They were focused on social mobility, in getting good jobs, getting bigger houses. So in that sense, they contributed to the Singapore story very well, right? Because they helped the economic development of Singapore. But what happened was the communities that existed in the kampongs, the community that is based on neighborliness, on ties with neighbors, that had disappeared, right? And we don't have that kind of community anymore in Singapore. So very common for older people to talk about the loss of the kampong spirit. Let me talk about memory, right? Memories of the fire are fading, as I said. So there are two kinds of memories of the fire, both of which are fading, especially the first one. All of you know about the rumors about the Bukit Ho Swee fire, right? Right. Those of you who came because you heard about the fire, you heard about the rumors, right? I mean, who knows about the rumors? Who has heard about the rumors? Sarafian, what are the rumors?
I live in Hougang. That was in 1977. 1970 I was born there. 1977, 78, there will be this particular guy called Mr. Ng Long Ha from HDB. I'm still trying to locate him, whether he's still alive or not. I think he passed. So he always come and sell ideas of buying HDB flats. So most of us actually disagree with it. And a few months later, the house was fired. I witnessed the fire myself. So my mother was so shocked, she wanted to remove the fridge from the house. So the thing happened was 1978, 79, at this Lorong Hock Chai.
Kampong Hock Chai, is it? Oh, okay.
So after that, this Mr. Ng Lohan came back again and said, you agreed to shift up. Not only my house, but other houses. So we started to shift up. 1980, this place called Grahala, just remained empty, and they started to build.
So what are the rumors? Huh?
Somebody, probably the fire was what they say it's a cigarette butt or some deliberate act.
So did you say this was what in 78?
78. I was in 72 at the time. I saw the fire in front of my house.
Yeah.
So we tried to shift up, but no, the fire was controlled by the fire engines.
Did you help to circulate these rumors?
We were young.
Oh, you were young. Okay.
But I mean, we bluntly spoke about it in school.
Okay, you're lucky you're young. So even almost 20 years after the fire, Bukit Ho Swee, the rumors, right, the association of fires and public housing and the intention, right, the rumors of arson that the government has set the fire in order to clear the squatters for public housing completely fits your story as well, right? In Hougang, that kind of thinking is still around, right? So this was quite a big thing after the Bukit Ho Swee fire, and probably in fires before and after Bukit Ho Swee, right? So because there was a war, right? A kind of war going on between public housing and kampong housing. So the association between the two was quite widespread. Of course, this is a conspiracy theory. I haven't found any documents to support it, right? And there are no newspaper accounts that say whether there's any conclusion or not. The police actually investigated the Bukit Ho Swee fire, but at some point the newspapers stopped reporting on this without any conclusion, right? So even when I was doing the study, the memory of the rumors was already fading, right? There were people who were still, who could still remember those rumors quite well, but they would say, I didn't believe in those rumors. I think only one or two people I interviewed said that they believe in the rumors, right? And I think this is one of the ways in which you can see people are changing in Singapore, right? They tend to emphasize the rule of law, right? The need for evidence. So there was no evidence, right? There were kind of an association or so-called suspicious circumstances. How come there's a fire and then there's the HDB is trying to build houses there, and after the fire, the HDB built houses there. I think I got a good photograph here. So this is on the Bukit Ho Swee fire in 1961. And on the top left-hand corner, right, you can see there's a block of flats. It's not very clear, right? It's a bit small. But there are actually people standing inside the block, looking down at the fire. So how come people are able to stand at the block? And this block is not finished, right? This actually, there's no, what do you call that? The wall, right? The wall has not been built yet. What do you call that? Parapet? Right? So people are actually standing there. They could actually just fall down, right? Onto the ground. But those were the flats being built before the fire started. And a few months after the fire, they will be finished. And the fire victims will be able to move into those flats. So to the fire victims, this was incredibly suspicious. Okay. The other thing I want to talk about, though, is the nostalgia, right? This is something that is, I wouldn't say it's fading. People are still very nostalgic about the kampong today. Sarfian, are you nostalgic or not about Hock Chai?
Of course.
Of course.
Yeah. I mean, I have to take for a fact that partly, it's in the eye of development. Things just happen. But I don't really totally coin on that arson thing. Yeah. But in the background, it still tells me that it was a deliberate act. How to say it?
So the nostalgia and the arson are connected?
Yeah, it's somehow. Another interview.
Yeah. The nostalgia for the kampong is very strong, right? And the idea of the concept of the kampong spirit has become one of the words in social memory, in the social memory and heritage of Singapore. What is kampong spirit? Is a form of self-help, helping people, helping friends, neighbors. And this happens when there is a lack of a state, when the state is not around to provide certain services, and people take it upon themselves to provide those services for each other. Nostalgia is a criticism of change and modern life, right? But there's often a question about, is nostalgia actually useful? Or people are just nostalgic but don't do anything about it? Right, so that's a question I want to ask. Right, I'll come back to that a bit later on. So I want to show this photo first. The nostalgia for the kampong, right? The kampong is actually a very modern settlement, right? In the years after the Second World War, the kampongs were always portrayed, at least those in the city area, right? They were portrayed as black areas. They were portrayed as areas which was dirty, which was disorganized, which was full of crime and secret societies. But actually, it's not true. The people living in the kampongs were quite modern, right? I mean, some of the older people in the audience may have lived in the kampongs, and you wouldn't say that you are not modern. You managed to adapt when you move into public housing. If you did move into public housing and you adapted. So I would rather see that the kampongs were complementary to modern Singapore. In fact, they helped Singapore to become modern. They were kind of a temporary solution for housing, and they allowed people later on to move into public housing. So the photo, right, is one of my favorite photos. These were 3 young men who lived in Bukit Ho Swee. This is not the typical image of a kampong dweller, right? I mean, one guy seems to be wearing a Ray-Ban, and look at the hairstyle. The guy on the left is wearing shoes, black pants and shoes. They are posing in front of one of the famous scooters. I can't remember the brand, one of the Italian ones. What's that? Vespa? Right. So these are very modern. Maybe not so much the older people, but the older people are a minority in those years, right? Compared to now, Singapore was a very young population. So the young people, the baby boomers, were actually very modern-minded, right? And the kampongs helped these people with temporary housing so that they could later on transition into modern life. So the kampongs and kampong spirits are quite modern things. They're quite good things that we can learn from. Okay, heritage. All right, so this is the last part. And I just take this opportunity to raise some questions about something that happened 60 years ago. Does it have any relevance for Singapore today? So the HDB, of course, went on to become extremely successful in building public housing. It's unprecedented. It's remarkable, right? But the HDB story is not finished. The HDB continues to evolve and continues to build housing and meet expectations for different generations. So expectations and the contexts of public housing are very, very different today. So what are some of these different expectations and contexts? So we all know, right, the $1 million resale flats, right? This is quite incredible, right? A 5-room resale flat in Bukit Merah, which 60 years ago no one would have wanted to buy, right? No one would have wanted to live there. They would have preferred to live in the kampong next to Bukit Merah, next to Red Hill. All right, and now it's selling for 1.6 million. And it's probably not just a momentary thing because there's a shortage of housing today, but I think the underlying issue is the public housing policy, right? The demand and supply, the open market, and the use of HDB housing for economic reasons. So that's one thing. The second issue, I think, is what are we going to do about the heritage of HDB estates? So it is too late for us to talk about preserving the kampongs, right? I think almost all the kampongs have been removed. But what about the HDB, the first HDB estates that replaced them, right? Those HDB estates are now old and aging. Some of them have been demolished. And, those en bloc development, and even earlier when they were replaced by bigger flats. But those that are still around and which still have people living in there, which still have residents and some kind of community, what do we do with them? Right? We still need space for new flats, but are we just going to continue to build over the old? Is there any HDB history that we should preserve concretely and also culturally? So there have been many en bloc schemes. I think you're quite familiar with these in many different parts of the city, right? Where either the flats are too old or they have earmarked the flats for redevelopment. So, for example, the one on the left, Rochor Center, and the one on the right is Dakota Crescent, Dakota Cassia. And that's a very good book, which I encourage you to read if you haven't. So those redevelopment schemes are especially disturbing for the older people who live in these areas, who have formed some kind of community with their neighbors who are unwilling to live. So it's almost the same as the kampong 60 years ago, right? That people are still unwilling to live their housing today, which is a bit strange because we have under the HDB a history of willingness to move, right? I mean, how many of you have stayed in the same flat all your life? Not many, right? Some of you might have. I have moved, I don't know, maybe 5 times. Yeah, and probably this is not remarkable. And I moved 5 times is because most of the moves are when I was young, right? I bought my flat 2005, so it's almost 20 years ago, and I don't intend to move anymore. But most Singaporeans seem to be willing to move and to want to move, but there is a group of people now living in the old flats who are not willing to move. So that's a question, right? Housing issue, the question of en bloc, the question of resale, BTOs seems to pit the generations together against each other. The older people who are owners and the younger people who need to buy either the BTOs or the resale flats. So how do we reconcile this? This is a policy question. I don't have an answer. I'm not going to pretend I know how to answer this question. But I want to think about the Bukit Ho Swee fire, about history and heritage, right? So much of public housing today is economically driven, right? We look at public housing generally as something that is economically profitable or viable or feasible. Right? We rent out our HDB flats for rental income. We use them for retirement when we downgrade. And some of my personal opinion, the people who flip the HDB flats, right? Who buy the HDB flat with the intention to sell them after the MOP has ended, to flip them for profit. That contributes to the problem, the speculation on HDB flats. So that's a very economic heritage of HDB housing legacy. But there's also a different heritage of HDB among the older people where there's some form of community, as I've said, and some kind of kampong spirits. So these are not kampongs, but there's still the same kind of spirits where the community matter, where memory matter, where heritage matters. So I just want to, someone I interviewed, right, Chalapandi Chalaya, he lived in Jalan Kayu village, which is just outside RAF Seletar, in the Seletar Air Base area in the 1950s and 60s. So I did a podcast with him, and he said that we should conserve the hard and the soft heritage of Jalan Kayu. The hard heritage are the buildings. The remaining buildings, you should try to conserve one or two of them, the more important buildings, right? But also we should conserve the soft heritage of Jalan Kayu. What is soft heritage? Meaning the kampong spirit, the community ties and bonds in the village, which existed in many of the villages and kampongs in Singapore. So again, I raised the question, is nostalgia useful or not, right? Is our nostalgia for the kampong, for our early HDB flats, is there something that can help us to look at public housing in a different way beyond the material? Should we consider conserving the old HDB flats and blocks, estates, and celebrate the kampong spirits in the HDB flats? Should we relook our housing beyond the material, look at public housing, as our community, rather than just as something that makes us money? This may not solve our housing issues outright, but it encourages us to look at the housing issue in a different way. So just to conclude, right? In terms of history, the Bukit Ho Swee fire was a historic, unprecedented fire. Memory, and from the memory of the fire, we can find new stories of Singapore through oral history. And heritage, I think if we look at the history and the memory of the fire, we can find new questions and ideas even to help us to think about our continuing public housing story in Singapore. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for staying. And thank you, Kaseng, for that stimulating lecture. I have, I think, one or two questions before I'd like to give the floor the opportunity to ask Kaseng. My question, Kaseng, is about your work, the book, right, which is important contribution to history of Singapore. I was wondering, looking back on that effort, now that you've seen certain changes that have transpired, would you have changed your methodology, or did you find new data to in a way revise certain ideas on the subject? Like looking back in hindsight, how would you assess your ideas in that book? Yeah, of course, hindsight is 20/20 vision, but yeah, scholars revisit their work, and I was wondering how you would revisit yours on the Bukit Ho Swee phenomenon.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So if I was doing the research again today, I don't think I'll have much data, to be honest. Well, first of all, the oral history would be a lot more difficult. I just tried to get one of my former interviewees. He lived in Bukit Ho Swee. In fact, he gave me that photo, right, of the Vespa. He was one of the persons sitting on the bike, on the scooter. I wanted to ask him to come onto my podcast, but he said he was too old. He can't remember, So the problem of memory, of fading memory. I was very lucky when I did the research, where I used a lot of Singapore Improvement Trust files at the National Archives. The SIT was the predecessor of the HDB, and at the time, the archives had decided that SIT files should be open access because SIT is a defunct organization. Today, no, SIT files are classified. So HDB controls those files. If you want to use those files today, you have got to write into HDB. And HDB is extremely difficult to get files from. So if I do the study today, it'd probably be worse than what it was. So I'm quite lucky in that sense. The other question about going back to the and rethink some of the things, I think I should have. I was still an academically minded. A PhD is to go into academia, right? So academics don't really care about heritage. You know, we care about writing for other academics. I didn't think very much about what the Bukit Ho Swee fire means for the housing, the heritage of Singapore. I think my conclusion was pretty bad. There was a lot of theory in the conclusion. You know, when you're academically thinking, you know, your whole mindset is quite different. Now I'm a heritage consultant. I think quite differently about heritage. I have a lot more respect for heritage, right? For people like Victor, for people like Sarafian. I used to be very skeptical about heritage, right? Like, all this heritage, not just nostalgia. What is it for, right? It's good for nothing, right? It's just this warm feeling or this sadness. But come on, what does it do? Then I realized that academics don't do anything either, you know? So I have a lot more respect for heritage and memory today. If I were going to look at the Bukit Ho Swee fire and update the book today, what I'll do is to think about the things that I've been talking about, actually the heritage, and what it means for the HDB story, for our love, for our romance with HDB flats. Right? How do we deal with that going into the next few generations?
I was also interested, Kaseng, on your work, your comparative work of like public housing in Southeast Asia. So can you talk more about this? Because you showed slides from Manila, and I think you did work there, no, for a bit. So I was wondering if we could have some insights into like public housing in Southeast Asia, or how like villages were transformed into like redevelopment areas. Yeah, at least comparatively between Singapore and another place like maybe Manila.
One of the first things I did after finishing the PhD was to come back to Singapore. I did my PhD in Australia to go to the National Library, and I was a Lee Kong Chian Research Fellow for 3 months or 6 months, and where I did the Sapang Palay resettlement project study in the Philippines, and as well as other squatters in Southeast Asia. The amount of information was very uneven. In some countries, there was a lot of, like your country, right? The scholarship is always wonderful, right? There's a lot of scholarship. Very good scholarship, which is very different from the Singapore scholarship. The Singapore scholarship was mostly on public housing. The Manila scholarship, a lot, because of the context is being different, right? Was a lot on the squatters. So a lot more useful, empathetic studies of squatters in Manila. So I found that quite useful. And I tried to do some study of housing and squatters in Southeast Asia, in Manila, in Bangkok. I don't want to talk too much about this because I regard this as a failure. I don't have the language, right? So I did some work on floods in Manila, in the squatter settlements in Manila, outside of the metro in Rizal, but it is very little. But I think that there's a lot of comparative work that needs to be done. The language is, of course, a big problem, right? I mean, if you look at the colonial period, there are 5-6 languages. If you look at the post-colonial period, there are 5-6 languages as well as different dialects. So it's quite problematic. But I think Singapore should look at and compare. Singapore should locate itself in Southeast Asia, because it is part of Southeast Asia, and its housing story has some differences from Southeast Asian cities elsewhere. but also some similarities. So I think that comparative angle is quite useful.
My last question is on art because we are in the museum and
That's a question I probably cannot answer.
this is like a disciplinal question. But I was wondering, as a social historian or also heritage advocate now, how do you think the artistic expression contributes to your work? Like looking at the works of some Singaporean artists on the fire.
Yeah, I think probably you're right that I should have also used the paintings a bit more in my book. I used the paintings as like kind of decoration, right? I didn't really talk about or discuss the paintings. I know Lily, you're gonna be very unhappy with me, right? Yeah. Yeah, so they are quite interesting paintings. Again, I encourage you to look at the paintings in the exhibition if you haven't. So the way that the artists have painted the fires of Singapore, that really reflects certain issues, certain trends that are going on in Singapore history at the time. So I think they show this struggle, right, between the two kinds of housing, and the artists are also struggling to come to terms with the fires, and with the public housing. I mean, anyone can see that the kampongs were a big problem, right? Because they were so fire prone, there was not enough sanitation and things like that. But at the same time, the new housing that came up was also a question mark, right? Because HDB housing is not new in the world. There's what do you call that? Council housing. There is social housing in the Western cities, and people knew what terrible housing those were. So the HDB success in Singapore was quite unique in that sense compared to what became ghettos, right, in Britain, in the US. So I think the artists did capture that, right, quite well, right.
Last question, casting. What caused the fire?
Something burned.
Okay, on that note, we open the floor to questions from the audience. So anyone who has one, the mic will come to you. Yeah, maybe
Yeah,
Lily?
maybe I can
Okay.
start.
Okay.
Yeah, just two questions. You were saying that there was a lot of suspicion about the fire. Was it a colonial hangover or was it level of competency? I mean,
What do you
colonial
mean
hangover
by
as in-
colonial hangover?
meaning they're suspicious that the fire has a social objective, push them into flats. Yeah, that's one. And then the second question is, you were saying the fire is very convenient for HDB, right? So were the villagers or whoever who lived there compensated? Because I realized that the Land Acquisition Act was only passed in 1966 and the fires is in 61.
I don't think I said the fire is convenient for HDB, right?
Okay, maybe that's my deduction, yes.
Let me see. We have a few questions. The Land Acquisition Act was passed in 66, but there was already a land acquisition ordinance before that, and there were fire provisions in the act when the Bukit Ho Swee fire happened, so that the government was empowered to take over a fire site if it wanted to. So there was already legislation for that. The 1966 Land Acquisition Act is for more a general acquisition of land for public use, right? So the government was completely legitimate or not authorized, empowered to take over the land legally after the fire. In fact, the question is previously the British colonial government and the SIT were quite unwilling to take over the fire site, to acquire the land, because it meant that you had to be responsible for housing people. And the colonial government didn't really want to do that until probably on a very small scale, right? They began to house the fire victims after the Geylang fires in 1953. And in 1958, the Kampong Supu fire, they actually built the housing for the fire victims and sold them sold, right? They didn't rent the housing out. So that was incredibly historic in that sense. It was far ahead of its time, right? Because only 10 years later on, the HDB would liberalize the purchase of HDB flats by allowing us to buy HDB flats easily, using our CPF contributions. Your first question was colonial hangover. I don't know how that's a colonial hangover, but the suspicion is always there, right? Because the SIT is trying to find land, and the HDB also later on, they're trying to find land, to acquire land, to buy land from landowners. And these land are very close to the kampongs. So, right, it's like if I were taking the perspective of HDB or SIT, it's a lose-lose situation, right? Like if you do your job well, you begin to build on these small parts of land that you acquire, that you buy. Kampong dwellers are going to suspect something is going to happen, right? But you are doing your job. You are a building agency. You are a housing agency, So the suspicion is not so much because the fire happened, or not so much the houses are being built when the fire happened, but because people didn't trust the government, right? They didn't trust the colonial government, yes, so maybe that's the hangover. They didn't trust the HDB or the PAP government in the beginning as well, right? So this took time to change, right? And the only way that it could change was by delivering, by showing people that HDB housing was better, was superior. And when people were able to buy the HDB flats, they began to decorate, to furnish their HDB flats. They began to buy things and beautify their HDB flats. Then that showed their love for HDB flats, right? So then they realized that HDB flats are actually superior in many ways to kampongs and shop houses. Yep.
Yeah, Lily.
Okay, this is on. It's always fun to hear you speak, Ka-Seng. You just tell it like it is. I have a question that riffs off of your last point on sort of what next, this nostalgia part, but specifically the question on community and economic pragmatism, right? So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the drivers of community building that is worth keeping? The few places that I've been to where older people talked about why they liked living in that community, it wasn't actually the HDB building, but it was the amenities, like the pasar and the hawker center and all that. So I just wanted to ask you, as you kind of think about what was before and what are the drivers worth keeping, and then what then moving forward, if we were to kind of get ourselves into a different state, right? We're not gonna be able to go back to the kampongs. There's no such thing. So what in your mind says, okay, we need to keep some of these things?
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason why HDB estates or HDB residents cannot form communities, right? It's not like communities can only be in the kampongs. So I'm a social historian, right? I write history from the point of view of the people, and that is because I believe that people are actually important in history. So communities are very important, I think, in all aspects of life. The only thing is we should have communities, but how are we going to build them, right? So in a place like Singapore, where the state is so strong, where the state almost tries to provide too much and solve all our problems, right? No state can do this, right? So we need communities in the HDB flats, and the first thing I think we need is the space for the communities. You need to give the community space to grow. If you provide everything for the people, then there will be no community, right? Why would people need to form communities? Right? Communities often arise because of social factors, because of historical factors, right? Because they have to provide certain things that are lacking, which you cannot provide, which you cannot attain on your own, right? So there's a need. If the HDB is providing all these, then why would there be communities in HDB flats? So, but I think heritage maybe is a way, right? Because the HDB cannot provide heritage. The HDB cannot create heritage. So, the nostalgia, the need for heritage is something that exists among the older people in the HDB blocks, in the HDB estates. So I think there is a beginning there where HDB residents who have been there for a long time, who know each other, who are neighbors, can make a start, with heritage projects. Maybe? What do you think, Victor? You live in a HDB flat. Share some of your thoughts. Front row, yeah. So Victor is living in Upper Cross, right?
Across it. Yeah, my personal concern is always that before the community can actually start getting together, it takes a while for them to get together, to get to know each other. There's always the talk about en bloc. And of course, in many of these blocks, you find that the movements of the tenants or the owners is pretty fast. I mean, in that couple of years that I stayed there, most of my neighbors have changed. And how do you build that vertical kampong? The vertical kampong, as my friends would say, it's very difficult, right? The only time you get to talk to people is when you meet each other and leave, a few smiles, a few exchange of greetings. And in the old days, it's like Japabwe, Hokkien, Cantonese, but now it's like, you don't know what language you're going to use. Right? So that takes a bit of more challenge to build the community.
So would en bloc then be a reason to be a community?
No, how is that going to so? Because in old days when you do en bloc, it's like, the tree goes down and then the monkeys all disperse. And they each one move to one different corner of Singapore.
Yeah, so you try to negotiate it. There's a reason to have a community so that you can have a voice when it comes to en bloc, right? It's not just something that HDB can do. The en bloc is a very powerful law, right? Because it's almost as powerful as land acquisition. If the vote for en bloc succeeds, then the en bloc will go forward, right? Regardless of what the minority thinks. So the en bloc is an issue which gives grounds for having a community, right? A community is not just something to come together and watch movie or, sit in a coffee shop, right? There are real issues that communities can address, that they should address as a group.
I'm not familiar if there's any strong community in the HDB estates, right? Maybe in the private condominiums or things like this, they might have. Of course, they have their own different challenges, right? People want to make money and things like this. But in the HDB side, it's more like what the youngsters will tell you, don't worry, Akong take care of everything. So they're more interested in making money, in building their families, in finding a better place. And every time there's en bloc, the impression is, I'm going to get a better place. Maybe my 99 years can now be extended. Right? There's always a lot of concerns. Most of us are living in HDB flats that are like above 40 years. And we are not sure. For most of us, even we have our own children, and we want them to stay with us. How? when you have an en bloc, there's always a challenge. You're going to split the family anyway through that process. So I think there's a lot of questions, but building the community within HDB is challenging because everybody says, the RCs can do it. But we know RCs are not really doing all the job because they are also working, and they won't be going around talking to everybody in every floor, to say, hey, what should we do about it other than usual mid-autumn festivals and things like this. So there's a lot of challenge, but I think the idea of community coming together is good, giving them space, but getting them together, I don't know. I mean, from my perspective, where we are the older communities, the only way we talk to each other is face-to-face and in the coffee shop. And when the coffee shop is gone, that small community gathering is gone.
Thank you for that sharing. So, sir, we have one over there.
Hi. I think I just want to add on that conversation as maybe a younger person in the crowd, coming from memories of things like kampongs and communities, hearing from my parents and older people around me. So right now on social media, there's a conversation about third spaces, a third place. So in our current situation where we have to work and we spend most of our time working, we have one place, our home, and the second place, work. But in our current lifestyle, we don't have a third place. So I remember, actually my parents still talk about it very fondly about having work and then hanging out at places like Adam Road, food court, or like the bowling alley with their friends. And then eventually you make more friends just by being there, the same place, maybe every week, every 2 weeks, and forming a community through that kind of experience. But I think as a young person, and I think I speak for a lot of us, we kind of lack that experience, or like that kind of spaces where we are open and we are fresh and we are friendly to communicating and enjoying each other's company without having to know each other prior. And this could be, maybe it's, at least I'm coming from like a freshly out of school for a year kind of experience where like I genuinely don't really have time after work to go and like find my own space. I'd rather go home, take care of myself, and like, have my own kind of self-care, because you're at work and you're traveling most of the time anyway. So you can't afford to have that like half a day, that whole night to go and like socialize. And I think that kind of comes with perhaps the loss of community, because it's something I experience as well. Because I see my parents with friends that really kind of stay through their lives, and they're like, oh, you're here again. Hey, hi, that kind of thing. But like for me, I have struggled kind of keeping up my friends, like, hey, when are you free? We have to schedule the Google Calendar for like the next 2 months. I'm free 3 weeks from now on a Thursday. Oh, you have a lecture, I'm not. So it's kind of that loss of like, I don't know, I don't want to say freedom, because we do have freedom of choice, but it's just the priorities have changed a lot in today's society. There's like a constant rat race that we're trying to keep up with. If you have free time, you rest, take care of yourself, or you read up, develop your skills, move forward. But there's this loss again of the third place. Like, sorry, I'm not sure of the gentleman's name in front, but he talked about going to the kopitiam. Victor, yes, you talk about the kopitiam. So this is a habit I kind of gathered when I follow my parents to the kopitiam. I follow them out a lot. But it's not something people of my generation tend to do. We don't. No, at least I don't. And Starbucks is a place of study. Sorry, Starbucks is not a hangout area for most of us. It's a place of study where there's Wi-Fi, you can get a drink, and you're out of your house for the day to study. Because when you're home, you're going to be seated in bed, you're not going to get anything done. So you might be with someone else, but there's no socializing, and there's a constant pressure that's actually looming on you even in the leisure space. So I don't know how communities can go to it. So I come from an art background. Like you come from history, I come from art and art history. We have a lot of works where and programs where we talk about community art. And especially through COVID, it's been something that's been lost. And it's been something that's kind of trying to rebuild itself with communities forming. But there's like a lack of kind of space for people to explore and grow in those areas.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your sharing.
Thank you.
You know, but the annoying historian in me will tell you that what you are experiencing is not new. You know, your parents' generation, which is probably my generation, and my parents' generation largely went through the same thing. You know, we didn't use the term third space, but as I said earlier, right, the middle class of Singapore were very inward looking, right? I mean, almost family oriented, self oriented. So those, I mean, they might go out to a coffee shop and bring their children there, but that is also not community space as well. So I think what I want to say is that this issue of community is, as you rightly point out, right, is not just an old people problem. It's a problem for all Singaporeans, for all generations.
Actually, I think it's more of a young people problem because I feel genuinely, I think older people, older generations tend to have a better flair for getting to know people and having that kind of community.
Victor,
Yeah, and I mean, and my question is, how do you establish a community after it's disappeared?
well, it's very hard to establish a community. That's the problem, right? Because if we look at housing, the space is taken up by HDB, right, which is taken upon itself, and almost as if HDB cannot extricate itself as well, even if it wanted to, because of our expectations as such. But I think history does offer opportunities, all right? History, if we look at history, there are always changes. History does not remain the same. So the fact that we have had a history of the state, right, providing of the social state, right, public housing state, as I call it, right, does not mean that HDB will continue or necessarily has to continue to provide all those services and that there is no possibility of communities being formed in Singapore. If there is a need for community, then there will be communities. That's the only way.
So how do you think we can create those needs and spaces? And
Historian cannot tell you, right?
I mean, but if you're looking from a historian point of view, then you probably have like kind of a retrospective, like this is what has happened before. And
what you can see from history is that because for a long time the SIT didn't build enough housing, the British colonial government didn't want to take up housing as one of its responsibilities. That's how the kampong communities came about, right? That's how kampongs came about, right? They were self-built settlements, right? The government agency didn't build the kampongs. The kampongs were built by private contractors. Like it was private contractors who built the kampongs for profit, right? But these people moved into the kampongs because they needed housing, right? And that's how the communities existed. And the other thing I will tell you, besides kampongs and shop houses, there was another kind of housing in Singapore that's often not recognized, and that is staff quarters, right? The quarters that were built actually by the colonial government and big companies, right? Like Public Works Department, by HDB itself, SIT, and so on. And sometimes by the British forces, the military forces. And those housing, these are actually modern housing, proper housing with toilets and piped water. They had communities. They had communities too. So it is almost like as if we had HDB housing, but low rise, not high rise, maybe up to 6 stories. But these houses had communities because also the economy was different, right? People had time for community. They had interactions beyond their flats, right? So kampongs were not the only communities. You don't have to have that kind of desperate housing situation to have communities. You had communities where there's a need for it, where there's a possibility for it. People had time, people had closeness to their neighbors, right? All this seems quite far away, right, in history.
But like Kakasang, is the void deck in the HDB a potential site of community building?
I think HDB encourages that. There's hardly anything on the void deck, right? Except those seniors' corner, I guess. But that's not conducive as well, right? I mean, I don't really go to a seniors' corner, but I think the seniors would prefer to go someplace where they can, buy a drink or have some place which the fans, there's ventilation, there's proper ventilation. I don't think you can turn on the fan yourself, right, in the seniors' corner.
Because I was thinking architecturally, that might be the space. Anyway, just thinking aloud. So maybe one more question before we wrap this up? Yeah.
Hello. Yes, one more question. Aware of time.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Loh. Thank you so much for your presentation. I actually read Squatters into Citizens, and I really think that it changed or at least my perspective, a rather stable image of the Bukit Ho Swee fire history, and it kind of changed my idea of a kind of more refreshing perspective of Bukit Ho Swee, and also, I guess, the idea of how do we determine who is a modern person, or who, I guess also the mobility of the people within the kampong. And yeah, so thank you for that. My question actually is, I guess I'm taking it back to the point that I'm interested in is the post-fire to the point of the redevelopment of Bukit Ho Swee. I understand that the development measures and the plans moved quite quickly, but I'm wondering if there were any modes of resistance post-fire who were kind of against the idea of building the HDB.
Not so much in Bukit Ho Swee. The thing about a fire is it completely weakens and disempowers the community. Right? They no longer have houses. So what can the community do? Usually the community will return to the fire site and rebuild it. So they can rebuild the kampong quite quickly. And then they can resume their life, and therefore they can kind of sustain the community. But when Bukit Ho Swee fire happened, the HDB wardened off, or the police wardened off the fire site. So the fire victims could no longer enter into it, and they relocated. They rehoused the fire victims in the temporary housing nearby, as well as in the Kallang area. So the fire, that's why a fire is potentially so powerful, because it disempowers communities. Resistance would have happened to public housing. Yes, there was resistance to public housing from organized forces, right? So I think in general, most of the political groups in Singapore supported the idea of proper housing, right? I mean, the kampong housing was not sustainable, all right? It was prone to fire. Whether someone burned it down or not, the kampongs were always going to be burned down, right? Because they were built so closely together, there were no fire breaks. The fire engines could not go inside the kampong. So, you don't need someone to carry out arson. The nature was the ultimate arsonist in that sense, right? But the question was how the conditions of public housing, the details, right? Like, are you going to give adequate compensation to the fire victims? Are you going to give subsidy for the rentals for the fire victims, or kampong dwellers in general being moved into HDB housing? So there were political struggles over this kind of thing, right? And not over public housing itself, but over the terms of rehousing. So yeah, there were two main groups of political forces that resisted. The first was the left, right? When the PAP split, some of the left, they had always organized the people living in kampongs, whether it's in the city or it's outside the city. They always represented those people when they are being rehoused. So if they are being rehoused, these parties would join in, not parties, sorry, but these organizations would join in and negotiate with the SIT on the terms, right? That you have got to give proper compensation. You have got to rehouse the people in proper locations, right? So there was resistance after the Bukit Ho Swee fire in other kampongs once the PAP split. The PAP split in the same year as the Bukit Ho Swee fire, actually. I can't remember political history now, but maybe a month earlier, in April, was it? So once that, the Barisan and the left would begin to oppose the PAP, and that became politicized. So that was not very helpful for people in general, I would say, because then the whole issue becomes a political issue. The other group that opposed some of the public housing is the UMNO, right? When Singapore was with Malaysia, and some of you might know, I don't want to go into this too much, but the PAP and the UMNO had a very big fallout in Malaysia. And when they were trying to relocate the kampongs and people living in the Beach Road area, Victoria Street area, the UMNO came in, the Singapore UMNO came in and spoke to the Malay residents and told them to fight the PAP, right? That's where we had the race riots in 1964. So that was a big problem for the government. That ended the following year when Singapore left Malaysia, right? And then I don't think you had Singapore UMNO anymore in Singapore, right? So there was for a short period of time, right? So after 65, basically the Singapore government, the PAP government was in full control of Parliament, and therefore the HDB had all the authority to carry out its public housing programs with hardly any organized opposition. Yep.
But like, was there everyday resistance from those who had to live there? Like their own, I mean, we were talking about this, right? Like, because there was alienation, but was there a way for them to, like in their daily lives, resist being, having to live there?
Yeah, I guess the frustrations for many people living in HDB housing, it was, going vertical. You used to live on the ground and now you are vertical. And it's not just the physical, it's also the economic and the social, right? You had to pay rent. And later on, you have to pay CPF contributions monthly when you buy the flat. Now, that requires a change in life, a change in your work. For instance, you could no longer have side income, right? You could no longer rear chicken. You could no longer have pigs. Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs talk about this funny thing, right? That some of the HDB flats, they would bring their pigs into the HDB flats, right? It was no longer possible. So it required a lot of reorientation of people, and there were growing up pains in a sense of people living of the first generation of HDB people living in those flats. So there were things like we talked about urination, right? In the lifts. That's a sign of protest in a sense, right? Antisocial acts. Yeah. But just to compare, right, with the kampongs, one of the interesting stories that I found in my research, right, in the kampongs, before the HDB gained the upper hand, right, what the SIT and the HDB would do previously, right, if they wanted to clear a kampong, they would move the residents out to public housing, and they would seal off the kampong, right, and they put some guards there so that the people would not go back. Well, of course, the people came back, right? They would break the seal and go back to live inside the house. Sometimes they will beat up the guards, the jagas, right? So there's a kind of resistance going on a small scale. And this happened very close to Bukit Ho Swee, actually, in a place called Covent Garden, right? You might know the place near Zion Road, near the Great World City today. And the SIT tried to cordon off the area, but the people kept going back there. And one of the kampong residents told the jaga, that you have no right to be there. This is my house, right? And many of the people who fought this SIT inspectors were actually women, right? The women actually were very fierce defenders of the kampongs. So one of the women had a broom, right? Took a broom, and it was covered with shit, right? Probably not human, but pigs maybe. And went after the inspectors, went after the jaga, right? And they also told the inspectors that you are a colonial, you have no right to tell me where to live, right? So in that generation, there was an awareness of people's rights, right? That this is my land. I'm not a squatter, actually. You call me a squatter, but I'm actually not a squatter. This is my land, and I have a right to be here. And you are an European. Why do you have a right to tell me where I can live in a country which is Asian, or which is going to be Asian soon, right, in this period of decolonization? So the resistance, you can compare the British colonial period resistance and the period after Singapore became independent, after the Bukit Ho Swee fire, is very different. The possibilities of resistance is very much reduced after the fire.
I think on that note of assertion, please help me thank Dr.
Thank you very
Lokaseng for
much.
this.
Thank you very much for
lecture.
your questions and comments. I really appreciate that.
And thank you all for coming. Thank you.